By 3:15 a.m., day one of the invasion, or 3 hours and 15 minutes into it after the stroke of midnight, when the tandem anti-satellite cyber strikes and also local usage in various areas of very powerful electronic warfare jamming assets of both the Russian and Chinese coalition forces, as the Kabini-equipped Su-27s, of which there were a few in the Su-27 fighter squadron tasked out specifically to just this particular battle space, jammed all of the redundant communications and even portable radar sets of the Americans, as had been done in the combat that had broken out against the Ellington Joint Base, whereby artillery, tactical ballistic missile strikes from the 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade of its element in East Texas had, as a Trojan unit, fired its DF-11As and DF-15C bunker busters in support of the destruction and rapid overrunning of the Ellington Joint Base by forces of both the 60th Combined Arms Brigade, sending in 2 of its mechanized infantry battalions, as well as the armored battalion from the 113th Combined Arms Brigade, totally overrunning this nucleus and nerve center of the city's defenses and the chief logistical station of the area, whereby the logistics would be transported to the support squadron and HHT, or headquarters of headquarters troop, over the entire 278th ACR, which was also its command elements, as these two forces maintained the forward logistical bases, which were of critical importance to the coalition forces to destroy. As Ellington had also been hit by close air support from Su-27 strikes, in addition to one of the strategic bombers, the massive Tu-22Ms, dropping enormous payloads on the facility, in addition to the missile strikes from also sea-based systems and the 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade's tactical ballistic missile strikes. As all of these forces had also begun to converge on their various initial objectives, which would be mainly to engage and annihilate American forces where they stood, as well as capture key critical assets such as power plants, as well as water and sewage treatment facilities, and much more. As the second of the 156 had been destroyed in the Channel View area, one mechanized infantry battalion, materializing literally several miles away to their south, had moved in and captured the NRG power plant with little resistance. As in the north, by 3:15 a.m., PLA forces in 3 different battalions, 2 mechanized and 1 armored, were moving in and seizing control of the George H.W. Bush International Airport, which would be utilized as the chief megafob due to its runway capacity and its large size after the combat ended and the victory had been won and the colonization operations were set to begin after the initial 4-day invasion phase, using 4th-generation warfare doctrines, which, in the South, other elements of the 113th Combined Arms Brigade and also even the armored battalion of the 60th Combined Arms Brigade were moving in to establish yet another megafob, and even air defense artillery forces from the 83rd Air Defense Artillery Brigade, support battalion, and one of its SHORAD battalions moved into the William P. Hobby Airport along with the mechanized infantry to secure the area for these forces from the 113th, with combat engineers and additional mechanized infantry forces moving in to bolster the strength of forces along I-45, which was one of the critical highways that the PLA forces set out to control, and a major logistical artery for the Americans, at least when they were operating from Ellington, which was now destroyed. By this point in time, at 3:15 a.m., enormous artillery fire was still blanketing much of the Houston core metro areas, inner city portions, with A300 300mm rockets striking the southern downtown area and even a little bit beyond. As the HHT was the last remaining logistical forward supply point, American forces had been bivouacked nearby in the form of the 1st Squadron of the 278th ACR in conjunction with the 1st of the 98th Cav, which itself, combined with the 1st Squadron, were two battalion-sized forces that had a heavy armored punch. As 1st Squadron, its combat elements consisted of 2 heavy troops, as well as a mechanized infantry or rifle troop, and they also had their support troop and their headquarters troop. As the 1st 98th Cav had 2 of each for its combat elements. It had 2 heavy troops and 2 rifle companies or troops, and it also had its logistical and support battalion and its headquarters battalion. Both of these forces bivouacked in various sites in southern Houston, relatively near the headquarters of headquarters troop over the entire 278th ACR. With these forces spending nearly 3 hours trying to form up, as again, due to no communications, due to the anti-satellite and cyber strikes and electronic warfare jamming, these forces needed to do everything through word of mouth and hand signals, line of sight communications. And they also depended heavily on transiting civilians for information, which showed the sorry state that the defending forces were in, as they'd lost all their ISR and communications assets due to these initial strikes at midnight with the anti-satellite missile strikes, which tracked each and every American satellite and brought them down with Dongning 2s, 3s, and S-500 hard kill weapons. And there was satellite dazing even leading up to the invasion, which blanketed at least the Mexico and Canada areas of operation, but allowed the Americans to see the naval drills going on off both their coasts, which was not only to serve as a distraction, but also to assist directly as a part of the external components who had essentially beach landed in Texas City, Texas, as it pertained to at least the 1st PLAN Marine Brigade getting 2 of its lightest battalions ashore in the form of its reconnaissance battalion, as well as its air assault battalion, supporting with its combat aviation arm of attack helos with its transport helo arm of Z-18 transport helos landing the air assault companies, with which there were 4 in the battalion. There was a maintenance company, a headquarters company, and there was the combat aviation company and the transport company. And then there was a separate section of 2 anti-submarine warfare helos, which were the Z-9Cs, whereas the Z-9WAs were the attack helo variant that supported the air assault and other operations of the 1st PLAN Marines, as they were now beginning to unload their forces ashore in great haste, using their recently captured port facilities to do so. They had practiced these types of drills many times in China as far as capturing ports and unloading their heavier assets of their more potent battalion elements, which were equipped with much heavier equipment like the amphibious type or ZBD-05 vehicles, which came in an APC version, IFV version, and a very potent assault gun / light tank version of amphibious vehicles, as by now, with the total capture of the Texas City, Texas area by the PLAN Marine forces, as they were beginning to offload their heavier elements, such as the Heavy Combat Battalion with its ZBD-05 amphibious assault gun / light tanks with their 105mm main gun, 12.7mm heavy machine gun, and of course their coax 7.62 by 54mm. And as these forces were beginning to push out their perimeter from Texas City, Texas, they would end up doing a broad sweep just off the map to the south before hooking into the core inner city, as they would fight their way through the Dickinson / League City area before moving into Alvin, Texas, and then beyond near Richmond, and then moving to the north and east up Interstate 69. As this was going on, common sites in this area where the Marines were pushing their way north and also to the east of Texas City, Texas, were such where there was scattered resistance and also abandoned vehicles all over not just the highway segments in the area, including this elevated highway segment up here where this car is just sitting. There were cars abandoned on the side of all roads and in empty lots and people's yards, including those abandoned on the highways, as PLAN Marine artillery forces of their artillery battalion, equipped with the PLZ-07 122mm self-propelled howitzers, were firing now from Texas City positions in support of their combat elements recently brought ashore and beginning to establish and push out the perimeter around Texas City, Texas, encountering tiny scattered groupings of military forces that had fled the Texas City, Texas area, consisting of naval forces, as there were the naval security specialists, as these were like dock security type elements, as well as also remnants of the hit by 22M over League City, the first of the 141st Artillery, which was a grouping of towed artillery forces that essentially were they who were carpet munitioned by the Tu-22M, with very few of their forces escaping this horrifying fate as they were just outside of the range of the strikes, as they had been positioned in other areas, although the main bulk of their forces had been beneath the strategic bombing raid. And as these forces pushed out, they not only encountered these, but also remnants of American paramilitary forces. As you can see, this ZBD-05 assault gun / tank amphibious is pushing its way down the road with wedge formations of troops on either side, including those equipped with their light anti-armor weapons like their Type 69 RPGs, their tube-fired 35mm grenades, as this Marine is firing one, and of course there's destroyed vehicles in pieces being hit by different types of weaponry, and there's KIA'd armed reactionary civilian elements. This technical's been heavily peppered with 12.7mm fire and shredded into pieces. As the Marine manning this heavy machine gun is firing in this direction, as the troops, the Marines, and vehicles are mutually supporting elements as they push on the flanks of the advance of their vehicles to assist their vehicles in guarding their flanks from any potential of anybody wielding any type of anti-armor weapons or even Molotovs, as these Marines have assaulted a position in a drainage ditch where forces are in a drainage ditch just off this illustration, this animation, where this Marine is firing his light machine gun, his QBJ-201, in the wedge, another just throwing a hand grenade in the drainage ditch as these forces attack these positions, as well as getting support from their vehicles. So you can see this explosive reaction protect the back of this turret, and their trowels they can drop as well as this, and that adds additional armor protection to the vehicle from the front and the back. As the attack helo further away, the C-9WA is flying in support of the heavier Marine forces, which these vehicles can carry a squad as well. As these loitering munitions, these CH-901As, are loitering over the area looking for targets, while the ISR assets lead the way and scout the area ahead, steadily updating the combat data links in the vehicles and carried by the NCOs in each and every Marine infantry squad or crew. And as the Marine 122mm artillery is hitting this thickly wooded area after ISR assets had found resistors here, they're pounding it with 122mm shell fire from the self-propelled PLZ-07 howitzers, with the helos also flying in support, munition support as well. As you can see, this man right here took quite a blow to his cranial area as well as in these extremities, and he got hit in his body armor, which didn't end him, but the rest did, as these forces pressed ahead into the area of the heavy battalions comprising companies, as well as the medium battalion and light battalion, which were the main potent combat elements, along with the recon air assault battalion, as well as the combat support battalion and the headquarters company, and also the artillery and air defense battalions as well. That comprised the entire Marine 1st Brigade. The 6th Brigade and the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, and 5th Brigades were configured in the exact same way, as the 1st PLA Marine Brigade here conducting its operations in the area to the south of the main core metro area as they were entering League City, literally off the map, about to sweep into Alvin and then to the Richmond area before moving north, as they had to clear the outer areas of the core metro area, similar to the additional brigades of the 83rd Group Army off map, doing the same to the east. As by now, conditions in this area were dire, as communications were still established by runners moving back and forth in this tiny area, informing the HHT of what was going on as these forces tried to get themselves together, which took a lot of time due to no communications in ISR. But eventually civilians had told them that there were PLA forces moving all through this area into the William Hobby Airport and beyond to the east, which essentially these armored forces, these 2 battalion-sized elements, these 2 squadrons, decided to protect their logistical stores by trying to attack and push away these forces, if not destroy them somehow, which played literally strategically into the hands of the coalition of the PLA and Russians, the VVS, who had their aircraft, those 3 Tu-22Ms that had not yet, as of yet, jettisoned their payloads, were orbiting the area as they had an enormous fuel capacity and could linger for some time over the target area and could be used even in a tactical capacity, as in destroying enemy units in the field. And that would be the trap set by the PLA forces deliberately, using their Russian allies to assist them in destroying the armored battalion, who now, as of reports from civilians transiting the area, these 2 armored battalions knew, these squadrons of Cav, knew that the PLA forces were near their position and threatened their supplies, as again, tactical ballistic missiles and sea-launched cruise missiles and now container-based cruise missiles had struck all through this area, but one thing alone had saved their logistics, and that was the fact that they were beneath a highway, and the PLA was not willing to destroy highway infrastructure. Hence, they were going to move in on the ground with forces from the 131st Heavy Combined Arms Brigade, who are now busy clearing the flanks and preparing their next move against the HHT, while these forces were busy establishing yet another megafob at the William P. Hobby Airport, and these forces up here were a diversion for this strategy by drawing these American armored forces, which were very powerful, into a battle whereby the Tu-20M could annihilate them in conjunction with the ground-based fires coming from the mechanized infantry forces equipped with their very potent man-portable HJ-08s, also their rocket-propelled grenades, their Chinese Type 69s with both anti-armor and anti-personnel ammunition, as well as the very sturdy Type 89A APCs, which served as mobile fire support platforms, essentially mobile machine gun nests that had very strong frontal armor, but it was their side and back that would be more vulnerable to any American anti-armor forces like the AT-4s and such. As the Type 89As were the most vulnerable of the PLA mechanized infantry vehicles, they did serve an important role as a mobile rolling fire support platform, and they could withstand essentially ample small arms and heavier fire from machine guns, but when it came to anti-tank missiles, they were very vulnerable on their side, top, and back. And although these Type 89As weren't alone, they also possessed their very formidable state-of-the-art VN-20 IFVs in each platoon, as the mechanized infantry battalions were 8 companies strong, with 6 mechanized infantry companies comprising part of the battalion, with also their fire support company with their 130mm easy to reload and very formidable 130mm multiple launch towed rocket systems, which could be quickly set up, quickly reloaded and fired, and they delivered an ample punch to enemy forces with this different fires coming from not only the 130mm multiple launch rocket systems themselves, the Type 63s, but also from the PLL-05 platoon, as each fire support company had 3 firing platoons, 2 rocket and 1 PLL-05 120mm dual assault gun / mortar, which would fire in support of the infantry forces, and then they had their headquarters and support company, which was the 8th company in the battalion, which was its command elements and logistical forces, as each headquarters platoon of each company was their command and logistical elements on the company level. As these forces were moving into the area of the Americans, the armored forces, which were quite potent in their M1 tanks, as they were moving into the area, they came with their Bradleys, their M113s, as the 1st Squadron and the 1st of the 98th Cav had their mechanized infantry or their rifle troops, and they also had their heavy troops, which were their tank forces, as their M1 Abrams tanks, which they had 3 platoons per company of the Abrams tanks, each having 4, and they also had 2 additional tanks comprising the headquarters with all the logistical vehicles and command vehicles, which were the command tanks of the entire companies, and altogether these 14 Abrams tanks made up each heavy company with their supporting vehicles. As the mechanized infantry forces had Bradleys and M113s, the Bradleys carried a punch as well. They had a very potent 20mm autocannon, and they also had their TOW missile systems and a coaxial weapon as well, their NATO 7.62. And as these forces in the armor could have 2 turret-based machine guns, typically a 240 Bravo and a M250 Cal, along with the 7.62 NATO coax with the main 120mm tank gun, these were formidable main battle tanks and had very good armor like the Chinese Type 96Bs and 99As, but they lacked some of the additional features that the Chinese tanks possess, like laser and IR scrambling, and also the trophy-like system on the Type 99A, as well as the newest fire control systems and also their ballistic computers, which were highly advanced in the Chinese tanks, a bit more advanced than what was in the Abrams. And with all these additional features, it made the Chinese tanks superior to the Abrams, although the Abrams was very close to what the Type 96B was in terms of its armor protection. So as these forces moved into the area, they would be encountered by mechanized infantry laying in wait for them, as they had total ISR dominance, as every squad had its own quadcopter reconnaissance drone as well as vehicle crew, and also the high altitude drones monitoring the area informed the PLA, as it was common sense with all the civilians and refugees and non-combatants and combatants alike transiting through the area, it was common sense that the Americans, after organizing themselves, which was allowed by the PLA without any artillery to hit them or anything, they wanted them all concentrated to make them easier to destroy, as that was common sense. And it was also common sense that the Americans were going to attack the mechanized infantry forces that materialized on a CCP property near their HHT, relatively close, only about 4 miles away. So these forces that materialized slightly to their southwest had spent 3 hours getting themselves in order, both battalions, the one of 1st and 98th and the 1st Squadron of the 278th ACR, they got themselves in order. PLA allowed this along with the Russian VVS so they could all get concentrated due to lack of communications and ISR, and as they would arrive, these forces would be laying in wait and the Tu-22M would completely annihilate them. That was the plan. However, one thing would go a bit wrong, where one of the companies of the 1st and the 98th, it's one of its heavy companies, as well as also even a rifle platoon, would actually survive by being just outside of the actual radius of the strategic air raid and used in a tactical capacity. There would also be close air support coming from 2 Su-27s that would fly in and fire their laser-guided and potent S-25 rockets, which are a line-of-sight weapon on a target with a laser to essentially make it a beam-riding laser-guided weapon. And also, they would fire their potent nose cannons at these forces on the ground, their 30 mil. And as they would do this, the PLA forces would be firing everything they had from their VN-20, their HJ-12E potent anti-tank missiles, their very strong 100mm main gun, and their highly destructive 30mm autocannon, which had 3 ammunition types, HE, APHE, which is armor-piercing HE, and then they had almost a Sabo-like miniature 30mm Sabo round, which was a 30mm armor-piercing rounds, strictly armor-piercing. It's like, again, a miniature sabot round in a way. As these forces would approach the PLA troops would be laying in wait using a drainage ditch along a street in a public park as their fighting positions. There's a lot going on at the opening of this map, and it will all be explained. As it's difficult, again, to explain these things in order, but it will be attempted. As the opening of this map, the headquarters battalion of the 113th Combined Arms Brigade had fired loitering munitions in support of their forces that would be laying in wait, enduring this trap that they had set for the Americans, who would fight back to the best of their ability and actually destroy 4 PLA armor personnel carriers, Type 89As. They would have a very difficult time doing any real damage to the VN-20 due to its laser and IR scrambling, which would interfere with the laser range-finding equipment on the tank, as well as FLIR pods for tow missiles and other type of weaponry that utilized IR or laser. As these forces approached, the headquarters platoons of each of these 3 combat companies or troops, 2 armored or 2 heavy and 1 rifle troop, the mechanized infantry, as one platoon had been dismounted with their forces in an area that was sort of was called shotgun shacks. I mean, it was not the most upscale of neighborhoods, but they had fencing, and then at the end they had a very low 3-foot concrete wall, which run and take behind before the bomber arrived in this specific position where it is here, dropping its massive payloads, and these vehicles are moving through the area, but now have been caught up in the total annihilation that was brought by the Tu-20M, dropping its massive payload as 2 squads in diamond formations had been dropped off to become advanced hunter-killer teams with their potent HJ-08s and rocket-propelled grenades to be utilized against approaching American forces with full loitering munition support, and also the close air support coming in from the S-25 rockets, 4 each fired from these 2 Su-27s, who are also strafing as they move quickly through the area. They strafe and then they pull up after firing their weapons at their targets, which they were fired further back when they were about here. As these loitering munitions are coming in, supporting their forces, the machine gun turret of this APC, of this Type 89A, is facing this direction, where this dismounted squad is moving up here to provide infantry support to their armor, which is now being hit at the opening of the map by loitering munition strikes with their heat warheads, these CH-901A loitering munitions. As these 2 were the command tanks of one of the 2 heavy companies moving into the area and firing, they hit this APC moving up in this direction beside this VN-20 that's also moving up, and its rolling shield double column formation moves into this trench with these other infantry squads to take fighting positions as other squads are laying on top, providing like a terrace of fire, the terracing of fire, where they could lay in the prone above the trench and fire over their own troops who were down in a safe position in the trench, in the drainage ditch. As you can see, there's walkways across into this public park, and there's the culverts that go under the streets, as you can see here. And loitering munitions moving into the area will continue moving up, because at the opening of this map, these armed civilian vehicles are being trying to screech tires to turn, but as they do that, they're completely destroyed by the fire from PLA forces, as well as the heavy strategic carpet munitions just got them on the outer by as this stay in their very shortly move in a very short movement. They don't move any further, protect their force, effect the and destroy all throughout this area as they stay a bit further back and up any further, as these are including the staggered squad facing this direction as they're firing. They have anti-tank weapons, 35mm grenades, rocket-propelled grenades, light machine gun, and general-purpose machine gun fire in some cases, while the vehicles are firing over them safely. Everything ISR directed and vectored to ensure total safety from any friendly fire incidents, this is one of the headquarters platoons. The fire support company and headquarters company in command of the battalion, in addition to 3 other of the mechanized infantry companies, as there's only 3 companies in this specific area that were mechanized infantry. The others are facing the other direction to protect the flanks of their fire support and headquarters company, with the fire support company firing off map at the headquarters company and support company or troop of the battalion of the 1st Squadron, which is moving into this area, their combat forces, including their headquarters elements moving up to support their attack logistically, as again they had to bunch up due to no ISR communications. As forces did so, they cartioned, and the last of the munitions about here because the blast radius is enormous, and the strategic bomber aircraft would continue on and drop the rest of its munitions elsewhere, as they had started dropping about a mile away before getting to this position, and they had shattered entire neighborhoods wherein the 1st of the 98th Cavs elements were literally beneath this specific air raid, and they had been completely annihilated, again, minus 1 armored company, 1 heavy troop, and 1 rifle company with its Bradley and M113s. I mean, not company, a platoon, rather, with its M113s and Bradley. They had survived the carpet munitioning by being a bit further away and lagging behind the rest of their combat elements moving into this area, whereby the Tu-22M had completely blanketed them with thousands of pounds of munitions, because it can carry 53,000 pounds of HE, which is, in modern terms, of using TNT as a metric, is far more powerful than TNT per pound. And this entire area was pounded and destroyed, as these arrows encapsulated in blue, including vehicles encapsulated in blue on the edges of the blasts that open up this map, where when the Tu-22M is about here, it's very high in altitude, so when it's flying quickly, it can drop its enormous payloads, and it would cease dropping them about here, and destroy all these homes in its path. As well as these forces moved in before the bomber had arrived in the area, they were exchanging fire back and forth with these PLA forces, including these supply troops running through the area with ammunition cans to drop them off for their forces, as well as rockets and more anti-tank missiles coming from their headquarters platoon elements. This fuel truck even took some 5.56 fire from across the way here, across the street, and they moved behind their Tiger MRAP, also being engaged and returning fire with its W85 12.7 millimeter heavy machine gun. There were even armed reactionary civilians that had gotten slaughtered by the fire from the vehicles across the Buffalo Bayou River tributary here. And these armed civilians came out of this building seeing all the destruction, and they fled into this manhole cover, a wise decision. There was civilian Metro rail that ran through this area, which is why it's the mauve color coded instead of the brown, which is freight rail. And they had 2 lines, one crossing south of downtown and one that went to the southeast into near the William Hobby Airport, which was being captured currently by PLA forces of other battalions. And this battalion was drawing off, essentially, a very strong American response towards them instead of the William P. Hobby Airport, which figured into their overall strategy. And that way, they could also defend I-45, which they had captured by moving into this position as they awaited the American arrival, because they had ISR dominance and could see them literally a mile away moving into this area. That's why they moved up their hunter-killer squads that they had moved across the bridge to set up in this area, and they were firing at this squad, bounding and covering behind the tanks that were now moving this way. These were the command tanks, and this was another platoon of one of the 2 heavy troops, whereby these loitering munitions at the opening destroy this whole platoon with their heat warheads. And as this tank moves here, being fired at by everything, including this VN-20, which is using its anti-tank missiles at close range as well, destroy these tanks in conjunction with loitering munitions. These tanks are being hit by multiple systems at one time, with the 100 millimeter main gunfire from the VN-20s flying at the M113s and Bradleys, as well as 30 millimeter autocannon fire, which would shred up a Bradley or an M113 with ease. Same with the rocket-propelled grenades against the M113. Maybe not so much the Bradley, but they could definitely destroy an M113 with their Type 69 RPGs, of which they had an enormous quantity of, and these were being run up to the troops as well, including with HJ-08 missiles to be fired continually at the approaching American forces, in conjunction with the support from the machine guns on their turret-based fires from their APCs, as well as the support from their very powerful VN-20 IFVs in each platoon. There's 9 of them here because there's 2 companies in this one area alone. And this headquarters platoon, this is part of another headquarters platoon, and then the headquarters platoon for this company is off the map further back. As these forces are being dismounted, they bound and cover tactically as this one moves across the football field and bounds and covers, and they hold their fire to allow them to get into the trench and make a terrace of fire right here to be fired at these forces before this strategic aircraft arrived. And these heavy machine guns, VN-20s, firing all their weapons with loitering munition strikes, as well as the air strikes, close air support from the strafing and fire of the very potent S-25 laser-guided rockets, with the arrival of the Tu-22M finishing off all of these forces and badly damaging this group right here, as these headquarters vehicles on the edge of the blast radius have been completely destroyed and flipped over due to the sheer force of the blast, with the tanks surviving only by the time they reached here, getting fired at by HJ-08 fire, as well as the loitering munitions moving into the area, slamming into these vehicles, and rocket-propelled grenades against these M113s, and some do hit the Bradleys as well. Although they didn't destroy the Bradleys with those, they destroyed them with other types of firepower. And as these tanks of this tank platoon were moving up with headquarters platoon elements, as there were 3 headquarters platoon elements with the 3 different attacking companies of the forces of the Americans, the 1st Squadron, the 1st of the 98th lost most of its troops in this strategic air raid that began further back, over a mile away. The only heavy company that survived, and the rifle platoon of one of the rifle companies that survived of the 1st of the 98th, would conduct a battle a bit later further to the south, as they were out of the path of the strategic air raid due to being further back in the line of forces. And they would fight near the William P. Hobby Airport, but that would be in a little bit later of a battle, as they had just narrowly missed being completely annihilated in this total kill box death trap, as the mechanized infantry forces with their different anti-tank weapons, HJ-08s and HJ-12Es from the IFVs, were completely laying waste to the American armor, like their tanks and Bradleys, while the rocket-propelled grenades were enough to eliminate the APCs. And these anti-tank groups had lost some troops in the combat. They briefly exchanged fire with these forces before they had finished them off with the assistance of vectored fire coming from 2 directions, which slaughtered these forces even though they were down on lower terrain. All the fire coming from here, like 35mm grenades and also light machine gun and small arms fire, as well as fire coming from them, had resulted in conjunction with fire even coming from a Bradley 20mm autocannon, which hit back here by the street on this embankment and KIA'd 3 troops in conjunction with the fires being exchanged back and forth between these forces, but these forces were eventually cut down, this wedge formation that tried to take cover at first behind their armor to give them mutual support, while these forces moved in here and exchanged fire, with heavy machine gun fire ripping right through this little concrete wall, in conjunction with anti-tank missiles fired at the wall, rocket-propelled grenade fire, 35 over the wall. I mean, this was hellish, this back and forth, but it didn't last very long, because once the bomber came in, they finished all of them off. As you can see, it's surrounded in red and blue due to the hail of PLA fire, in conjunction with the heavy strategic air raid that eventually wiped out all these forces except for one of these tank platoons that moved in the area with a few Bradleys and APCs, which got destroyed by the forward anti-tank, the hunter-killer teams, that also fired from this area. And as these civilians escaped here with their lives, well, these got slaughtered from fire across the Buffalo Bayou by the railroad tracks, the Metro Rail, which also ran south, as there were lines that ran through this area. These forces here, supported by firing over this embankment at these forces as well from this diamond formation, and they too took some fire. And the heavy machine gun on this APC fired back at these American troops as they ran into this position, with the heavy strategic bomber aircraft ceasing dropping its munitions here and continuing on to be used elsewhere if needed. All of these forces here had been totally annihilated by the strategic air raid, the tactical close air support for the troops, and all the hail of different fire coming from all these forces, everything from the man-portable anti-tank systems to the 12.7mm heavy machine guns, which were very destructive, in and of themselves, as well as 100 millimeter and 30 millimeter autocannon fire from the IFVs, the 100 millimeter main gun, and the HJ-12Es fired at vehicles, and HJ-08s and rocket-propelled grenades and 35 millimeter tube-fired grenades and general-purpose and light machine guns and small arms fire coming from the infantry troops, peppering this whole area, as included these houses are all covered in red. These troops are red. All this is covered in red and blue because it gets destroyed in the enormous strategic air raid utilized in a tactical capacity. As these troops run through this playground area, these are the supply troops running up ammunition. And by this basketball court, these troops have been dismounted and bound and covered tactically to get safely into the drainage ditches. These are all being engaged in their terrace of fire, lower level, higher level, firing at these forces. And then as this Tu-22M has finished off most of one of the battalions, the 1st of the 98th, minus a company and a platoon, the headquarters elements are being hit heavily by the fire support companies, PLL-05s, and multiple launch rocket systems, the 130 millimeter, firing over the battlefield and hitting those forces that are off map heavily. And the outer radius of the blast also destroys some of their vehicles just off the map of the headquarters and supply forces, who had to bunch up with these forces in a long line of vehicles so they could communicate through line of sight, hand gestures, and yelling. That was how bad it was for the Americans, and they had to depend on different civilians crossing through the area to inform them of what was going on and where. It was a horrible situation. And again, as these forces moved just across the river over this bridge, and these forces moved in, they were being heavily engaged as this diamond formation moved up, and the medics were very busy running back and forth, collecting the deceased and treating some of the wounded, evacuating them as well. They would get rewarded for their efforts, putting them in this trench where they'd be safer before they could be evacuated with the headquarters vehicles to be taken care of properly, as these forces were risking being fired at, as this bridge had a concrete abutment on each side where they took cover behind to get on this side and pull them out and get them to the trench. These guys tried to support them with all the fire they could as they communicated through radio, and the NCO carried combat data links to stay in touch and communicate and coordinate their actions together, while the Americans had no communication and had to use line of sight and hand signals. These two forward forces were very brave for doing what they did and moving ahead of their other forces to act in a protective manner of their vehicles, who also protected them from a distance, firing as mobile fire support platforms behind their troops who were ahead of them, trying to protect their vehicles, give them mutual support, vehicle and infantry support to one another. And again, they lost 4 vehicles, they lost 4 armor personnel carriers, and they had some others that were damaged fairly badly, like this one right here. And this one, as well as this one moving in that got hit by a tank shell directly in front of it, was destroyed as these tanks were moving and firing. And this vehicle here was also destroyed by a tank shell. So they had lost actually 5 vehicles total. They had lost 5 armor personnel carriers distributed throughout the different platoons. The other vehicles are damaged minorly, like the fuel truck taking some 5.56 and fleeing behind the cover of the MRAP, who was firing and taking fire. And all these vehicles, they took fire, but they returned and meted out heavy fire against these American forces as well. And they had eventually annihilated, with the assistance of the strategic bombing raid used in a tactical fashion, these forces. They had finished them off, with the only last remaining combat elements that were not swallowed up in the enormous munition blast, moving on 2 sides of this Buffalo Bayou River area tributary, and these forces finishing them off with HJ-08 fire and loitering munitions support, which was heavy in this area, as the headquarters dedicated drone section had fired a volley of 48, and they all came into this area and even hit elements that were off map as well, as they loitered over the area and looked and sought out enemy targets of critical importance on their AI target seeking mode, with this tank even being hit before the bomber came through by an HJ-12E fired by one of the different VN-20s in the area, as there were 9, due to there being 9 different combat platoons in each of the 3 companies, with their headquarters platoons positioned near them to again run supplies up and keep the fire going on these forces, as logistics meant everything in combat. And although they stayed back a bit safer of a distance, and the armored recovery vehicle even took some fire, so did the MRAPs, they saved their fueler as fire was coming through the area and smacked into it with small arms fire, which put some holes in it but didn't destroy it, fortunately for the PLA troops. And their supply troops ran the gauntlet of fire, and one even got wounded while running up ammunition cans and rockets for the RPGs and also anti-tank missiles to their troops, who were holding the line against this armored fist with the help of the Tu-22M and the close air support and loitering munition strikes. All of this was highly devastating and ended up costing the Americans essentially 2 battalions minus 1 company, as even the fire support company was firing over the map and destroying the weaker headquarters vehicles of the headquarters company or troop of the entire battalion of 1st Squadron, and also the support troops. They were being fired at by 130mm rocket volleys and 120mm heavy assault gun mortar strikes that were arced fire as a mortar and hit in this area and destroyed their vehicles that weren't in the direct path of the Tu-22M, although the outer radius got some of the other vehicles, as they all again had to bunch up due to no communications. Loitering munitions made a massive difference, along with the Su-27 strikes, and the Tu-22M was the main star of the show in this instance, completely eating up nearly 2 entire American battalions, as well as many innocent people that were still trapped in these neighborhoods, as these forces laid down heavy fire against the Americans, who tried hard to fight their best and ended up destroying 5 PLA vehicles and a number of their troops, but it was distributed among 3 different companies and ended up, in the long run, being very minor damage. But the battle was a heavy battle, and it cost on both sides, but mostly on the American side, as their casualties were heinous, as these vehicles went through the area and troops destroyed throw at them rocket-propelled grenades, S-25 rockets, similar in some ways to the other air-to-ground fired missiles, HJ-08s. This being similar to what occurred with the People's Armed Police as they fought the 3rd Squadron, which was a raid in a similar form, also in a neighborhood, although the neighborhood they fought in was much nicer than the neighborhood that was being fought in this inner city area, which was, again, comprised of a lot of shotgun shacks, and it wasn't the best neighborhood, but it definitely, the people there were unfortunate to be trapped in such a heinous battle, as there were businesses in this area with multi-floor buildings, and these armed civilians were transiting the area, but these got slaughtered by vehicle-based fire, while these managed to come out of the building and escape in a manhole, as this rail line ran through this area and also another running down to the William P. Hobby Airport area, which was being captured by PLA troops and would be fought over in a later engagement. As all these forces had been destroyed in this trap laid by the coalition, the other forces were engaging armed reactionary civilians near the William P. Hobby Airport, about to be joined with the surviving company and rifle platoon that escaped the destruction, the heavy company and rifle platoon of the 1st and the 98th, that would join them in the fight in this area that would become an armored battle, as the armored battalion from the 60th Combined Arms Brigade was racing up I-45 to the airport as well, along with all the mechanized infantry, combat engineers, and air defense forces moving in to capture their new acquisition. In the next battle, the People's Armed Police, striking into the northwest of the city, were in heavy combat as they raced on to their objectives in downtown, engaging and destroying pockets of armed reactionary civilians with heavy artillery support as they moved deeper into the city. In the next video of the Hypothetical Invasion documentary series highlighting 4th generation warfare doctrines.